Hi, this is Professor Kinney, and today we're going to look at 4 different techniques for implying three-dimensionality. In this case, we're going to use 4 orange circles, as you can see here, and we're going to explore 4 very different ways of implying light and shadow to sculpt a three-dimensional effect using the two-dimensional program Adobe Illustrator. In the first instance, we're going to use the blend tool, and so to do this we need a start object of one color and an end object of another color. I'm going to use this base circle here, and I'll just option drag a copy of it using my selection tool, and the second copy I will scale down, and I will place in the area that I deem will be the highlight for me. And if I wish, I can rotate it slightly. I will give it a highlight color, so a slightly lighter color. And then select both the background object, the larger circle, and the smaller highlight object, and then use the blend tool, which can be found right here. There's the blend tool. And when we use the blend tool, we generally want to map a start point to an end point. And in mapping, what I do is click a start point on the beginning object and tell it that I want it to end up being this point on the end object. And it generates a series of blends. Now, how this blends is controlled by the blend menu. If I go to Object, Blend, I can look at blend options. And right now it's rendering as many intermediate shapes as is necessary to generate a smooth transition of color. I could specify a number of steps or make each duplicate a specific distance apart. Typically, for what we want to do, we would use smooth color. You'll notice if I change the location of any of these elements, I'll use the direct selection tool, it reblends that object. And in fact, if I were to say use a tool like the warp tool right here to deform that shape in some way, you would notice that it would also alter the blend to accommodate that new shape. So that's one way of creating a blend. Another way is using this tool here called the gradient palette and gradient tool. These two things work in conjunction with one another. The gradient palette allows us to apply a number of preset gradients to an object or customize one. For now, I will choose a radial gradient, and you will notice that it's using a basic black and white, the black being the start color, the white being the end or highlight color. And when I choose the gradient tool or a gradient vector tool, I can control where the position of the highlight falls. I can also rotate that, stretch it out in order to make the gradient more gradual. And of course, I can alter my start and end colors, make my start color an orange, a very light orange, make my end color a very dark orange. And again, you can see how I can control that. Obviously, the closer that these points are, then it gives the impression of a shinier surface because the transition from light to dark happens very rapidly. Again, that's controlled with the gradient tool. How the gradient is colored and the type of geometric distribution of color is controlled here in the gradient palette. Just again, notice as I stretch that out, it slows down the transition, giving the appearance of a surface that's not quite as glossy. You'll notice I can also control the distribution of color using these color sliders on the gradient tool, giving quite a different dispersion of color and consequently implying different qualities of surface. In the second instance, I'm going to use, very much like the first instance, two copies of the object. So I'd option drag a copy here. I'll make this copy much smaller, and I'll move this. And in the second instance, I'm going to use kind of a combination of these two effects. In the second instance, I'm going to fill the top circle, the smaller one, with a gradient. So if I go to the gradient and I choose a linear gradient of black and white, I'll move the white up here, I'll rotate it, move the gradient up a little bit, there we go, and in this case I'll choose the black. I want you to notice the color palette here. In a basic black and white gradient, it's using 100% black. I'm going to mix in what is called a rich black. That's a black that's comprised of all the primary colors, or portions of them. It just gives a much richer, deeper translation of black. Now what I'm going to use in conjunction with this is the transparency palette, and I'm going to set the transparency to screen. And what that's done is it's created the illusion of a high gloss surface, where this is perhaps a light of some kind that is falling upon this orb, and that light is being reflected back to the viewer. In the final case, I'm going to use the mesh tool. And the mesh tool, of course, allows us to pick out a particular point and apply a highlight color to that point. It then becomes distributed across the surface from one end of that mesh to the other. Command Z to undo. What I'm going to do in this case, I'll zoom in first, is I'm going to box in this area where I'm going to place my highlight. And what that does is it limits the dispersion of color to within this boxed area. So now, if I were to select that same point and apply my highlight color, you will notice that its dispersion has been limited in the extreme. Command Z to undo. In this case, I'm going to create a high gloss effect by doubling up on this boundary. And what that's going to allow for is a very quick transition from highlight color to base color. And again, I'm going to double up on this line here. I'm going to create really a window effect either side of this. And so if you look at that pattern, it's very much like a rectangular window. And what this allows me to do now is to select individual panels, apply a highlight color to that panel, likewise. To give them all the same color, of course, I could select that panel, use my eyedropper tool, and sample this color. Likewise, Command key gives me access to my direct selection tool. Select another panel, sample that, click there, sample that, and in effect I've created the illusion of the reflection of a window, which I can distort in any number of ways. I could select these points along the bottom, just these ones. Hold the Shift key to select more than one. And I could have that color taper off by not giving a solid orange, not a solid yellow, but perhaps an intermediate color. So I'll really zoom in to choose this intermediate color right here. and you'll notice it softened that transition quite significantly. So if we look at that now, you'll notice that there's a nice soft transition here at the bottom to the yellow, much brighter here. Of course, I could give this more of a distortion to really emphasize the curvature, and again, this could be handled using the direct selection tool, and by using the direction lines that are part of the grid system, we could very easily cause distortions in that mesh that help to emphasize the illusion of the sphere. And we can bring these back this way. Again, and you can see how we can bend that light to make it look like it's conforming more to that spherical surface. So there you have a technique, 4 in total, that can be used for creating the illusion of 3 dimensions. The blend tool, the gradient tool, the layering of objects, one of which had a gradient fill in black and white, whose black was set to rich black and was given a transparency of screen. And finally, the use of a mesh tool to impart color. Thank you.